So this is a talk by Professor Faadiel Essop, who's a fellow of the Royal Society of South Africa, and he's the director of the Centre for Cardiometabolic Research in Africa, or CARMA, at Stellenbosch University. And the talk is From Technique to Thought, Expanding the Horizons of STEM Postgraduate Training. So I'll give you a little bit more about that in a minute. Wrong. Sorry. And then this is just a plug for the membership. The benefits, you get the transaction, invitation to talks, and we get top South African and international scientists and others talking. We co-run with the Academy of Science of South Africa, so that's very nice, and there's their website. And then we have several new members. I'm not going to read them out, but you can see where they are, all at Wits University on this page. And then there are some more who are not at Wits University on the next page. And then we have future Royal Society ASAF talks on Zoom, normally on a Wednesday. And here they are listed. Go back. Coming up. And yeah. So if you've got any queries, please look at the website. And then what I'm going to do is I'm going to stop sharing so I can, I think I got rid of part of the presentation. So what I'm going to do is just give you something about the speaker. Our speaker, as I've said, is the director of CARMA at Stellenbosch University's Medical School. He completed his doctoral studies at the University of Cape Town and worked as a Fulbright Fellow at the University of Texas Houston Medical School. He is investigating the effects of chronic stress on cardiometabolic disease onset and the role of immune activation in HIV-related cardiovascular disease. Prof. Essop was formerly president of both the Physiological Society of Southern Africa, PSSA, and the African Association of Physiological Sciences, AAPS, and is an elected council member of the International Union of Physiological Sciences, IUPS. He's a fellow of the American Physiological Society. He's been awarded the PSSA's prestigious Lifetime Career Achievement Award for Research Excellence. And he's also, said this before, an elected fellow of our Royal Society. So that's the Royal Society of South Africa. He recently received the prestigious Teaching Advancements at University Fellows Award, or TAU Award, for outstanding contributions to transformative education, and particularly for challenging scientific elitism within the medical field. So with that, I think we're ready to start. So please take it away, Professor Essop.
Thank you so much to the chair. Do you want me to leave my video on, or let me just see if I can share this?
It's totally up to you. I'm going to take mine off.
Okay.
And mute myself.
So let's see. I haven't used Zoom. We normally use MS Teams. So where do I share this?
I think it's down at the bottom. It's green.
Okay. Let me just go
then
back.
Get your presentation up already.
Is mine showing?
Not yet.
I am just trying to find this.
Make sure it's opened.
It is open, yeah. So the green one, share screen. Let's try. You can tell me if it's showing.
It's coming.
Showing?
Yes. Great. Thank
You
you.
can see the first. Yeah. Am I all? You can hear me and everything. It's fine. Okay, great. Thanks a lot to the chair for the kind introduction. And is it evening? Good afternoon to all. So as mentioned today, I'm going to talk a little bit about postgraduate education and training. Specifically focused, I'm going to talk about the biomedical sciences, which is my field. I'm housed in that building at Stellenbosch University's medical school. But I think we can extract the principles more broadly and apply to the STEM and not only into the medical fields, and hence the title of my talk. So we're talking about lecturing, and so I think crucially for us as lecturers to be aware that our teaching is shaped by who we are, what we believe, and there's other things, cultural, institutional contexts that play a role. And so it basically means that there's a holistic and situated nature of being an educator. And so I think this critical reflective practice is a crucial aspect of that. So in other words, we've got to continuously examine and critically think what we're doing, our assumptions, whether it's in the lecture or outside, what would be the impact of that? And then obviously what would pass as good management practice. Then I've added another tag on there. It's not only being reflective, but also being a bit of philosopher. I think it's very important because we did, most of us, probably a PhD, which is a doctorate in philosophy, no matter what discipline we did that in. So we're not only critically reflexive and we're not only just self-aware, but we're aware of broader context, socially, politically aware. And then we use such an awareness to act with integrity, to act with ethically, and together then education can become a transformative practice in the end. So it brings us then to the purpose of a university, and there's various definitions of this. So I like this particular one by Wendell Berry because it resonates with me. That we actually, what do we do in a university? So Berry states that we're busy cultivating humanity and to make human beings in the fullest sense and not just trained workers or knowledgeable citizens. And so that's important because we've, in my opinion, become at the postgraduate level a lot more technically orientated, technologically orientated, to supply the so-called knowledge economy. And this definition would speak more broadly, that it's not only about that, but for our students to be responsible heirs and members of human culture, to continue the quote. And that underlying the idea of the university is the bringing together, the combining into one of all the disciplines. So we've got to look a bit at interdisciplinarity, transdisciplinarity as well. Do we do that? Not enough in the STEM, I believe. And so that then should lead to good citizenship as a byproduct and a fully developed human being. So we need to thereby cultivate individuals as our students who can think critically, be creative, think independently, but at the same time act compassionately and with empathy and become change agents by contributing to a just and sustainable world. So if we look at this is Stellenbosch University's graduate attributes, but I think this would be universal. Most of these things would be captured by other institutions, so it's not necessarily unique to us. But these are some of the graduate attributes you can see: inquiring mind, well-rounded individual. It matches that previous definition. And then for the faculty, for us to be critical and scholarly academics, to have engaging curriculum design, that we do that in a dynamic fashion as well. And then there's some themes from our university, but again, this I think would apply beyond Stellenbosch. So two of them so that we create a transformative student experience. In other words, you want to create a unique, personalized student experience that serves as a catalyst for transformational change, and you want to develop those graduate attributes. And then also another one I've highlighted, networked and collaborative teaching and learning. So the idea is we create teaching and learning communities where students and staff, lecturers, they experience meaningful learning. That's important. And that we ideally focus on partnerships where the students become co-creators of knowledge. So meaningful learning and co-creators. So if we look at this particular slide, and it's on the Chinese alphabet, and I asked you to memorize this, let's say for 15 minutes, both the question side and the answer side. And then in 15 minutes time, I would give you a multiple choice question and then ask you to supply me with the answers. And that I think the chances are very good that you will come up with the correct answer and pass the test, so to speak. But what has happened there? Has meaningful learning actually occurred? Has learning with understanding occurred? And would you know the Chinese language after going through this exercise? You would know the answers to the questions, but did you understand the questions in the first place? And there would be no meaning. So it symbolizes what we're doing at the moment. More and more content, less understanding. And so this author, and I agree with him, Stephen DeCarlo, said we should begin to change this. Can we look at the amount of factual information that students are expected to memorize? We live in an era of Google and of AI, information literally at our fingertips. Can we decrease the use of the passive lecture format? And can we help students to become active, independent learners and problem solvers? So much like what I've said before, and that I want to continue emphasizing, that the value of the teacher is not determined by what he or she would know, not necessarily your unique reservoir of knowledge or the beautiful way you impart that, but the ability to stimulate in others the desire to know. So that students begin to construct knowledge actively. Learning occurs by exploration, by questioning, discovery. And that becomes an intrinsic motive. And that curiosity then is the natural drive that should be cultivated. So bearing all of that in mind, a little bit about my discipline, bearing the context in mind, we focus, as we can see, the sculpture in Poland, a fisherman, young boy, treading the tightrope of life literally to survive. And physiology, much like that. Big concepts such as homeostasis, the processes by which living organisms try and maintain a stable environment, because we live in a changing world, external stressors, internal, and we try and maintain the body's ability to regulate factors, whether it be temperature, pH, blood pressure, glucose levels. And then together with that, another big idea is integration and communication. As we can see the crisscrossing here in this diagram of the various lines of communication. So there's crosstalk, and all of this done together and integrated to ensure overall health and well-being of the whole of the organism. So is physiology hard? Yes, for some students, yes. So this was a faculty survey, interestingly, not the students. What do the professors think? And they ranked the responses, sort of from the top ranked to the lowest rank. I've pulled out a few. So some of the issues faculty identified is that physiology requires students to reason with causality mechanistically. Top. Fail to appreciate integrative nature of the mechanisms. I mentioned the crisscrossing, and that they compartmentalize knowledge and systems. Heart system apart, liver, that they can't bring it together. And then they think learning is equal to memorization of facts. I've mentioned earlier, content-driven. And the lecturers themselves noticed this. They talk too much and the students too little. Although it was ranked 13th out of 17, but it's still there. So it's clear then that there's an issue with passive sort of sharing of information, as we can see in this schematic. This is 1859, the Smithsonian Institution, that, the sage on stage, professor sharing with students. They internalize it by memorization and regurgitate it. And so we need to move away from this. And so some of these principles, like Chickling and Campson's, promote the idea of active learning. Okay, so that we begin to teach and create a supportive, active, student-centered environment and learning environment. Using some of these things I've listed, that they can collaborate in class, we put high expectations there, we give good feedback, and they begin to construct knowledge. So there's this constructivism happening, where students engage in doing things, and they think a bit more about what they're doing actually in the classroom. And this then would promote deeper understanding and critical thinking, and also linked to academic success. So I'll give you a couple of examples for the rest of my talk of some actual things I've done. This is with an honors class. So on the left hand, you can see the normal way that things were done. So CV, cardiovascular, course content. This is the layout. These are the objectives. These are the outcomes. And this is the content. All the lectures to be read. And then there's a class test to assess that. So how about we flip this a bit, the script. So instead, when I went in there, I asked the students, lecture 1 and 2, we're going to talk about CVD's, cardiovascular risk factors, that I want you to identify within your environment. So that was a lively discussion to and fro. They went back, came back in following class, further discussions, and they identified 6 factors that affects them. And then we based the whole course around those 6 factors to gain a deep understanding of these factors. And all the teaching and learning activities were focused on this to strengthen that. A bit of lecturing, case study discussions, group discussions. They brought articles to class to discuss. They made posters to discuss and share, and group work and so on. And at the end, the assessment was an integrative essay, which I'll talk about more. And then we said we're going to take the outcomes of this work, and I'll take it to the rectorate and share it with and see what we can do. And so these were the risk factors identified by the students. Substance abuse, sleep deprivation. It's ones what we would expect: alcohol, stress, poor diet, smoking. So that became the curriculum. And then I challenged them that they needed to go and speak to other students outside of the faculty, art, humanities, and talk about these factors. That was part of the essay. And they needed to incorporate that information as well. And then they had to consider the impact of these exposures in terms of cardiovascular diseases onset, CVD, each factor, and integrative collectively. And then they had to come up with recommendations to address these issues that I was going to share with the rector, and then also recommendations to their fellow students how they could try and address this. So, and they had lots of ideas. I'm just pulling out a few here that we shared with the rectorate. So one, they suggested do a full survey for the SU students of the 6 risk factors, tackle stress and mental health, increase good healthy food but cheap on campus, smoke-free campus, and the drinking problem. And they came up with some ways to do that. So I sent that to the Vice Rector of Teaching and also Research with some background. And this was the response. Thank you for sharing the study of your students with us. We shall explore the many practical suggestions with Student Affairs, and they will discuss it with the Senior Director, who might copy on your document. And the research DVC said this was insightful, and I shared the feedback with the students. And so in terms of theory, this shows that this approach is about fostering learning that's transformative, and the students can see that knowledge is actually a way to lead to change, to social change. It's not a passive thing that I need to acquire. It's not an end in itself, but a means to lead to an outcome, and hopefully a positive outcome. The next one, and this is the second one, the last that I will talk about, is a building that I worked in whilst I was at the Stellenbosch campus. And there was a blank wall that I thought we need to fill up with some artworks that would represent inclusivity and so on. And it's a long story, but I co-opted people from visual arts. They knew what they were doing. And we worked with people from the whole building, different departments, from the student level up to the professor, to the cleaner. And we ultimately, after several months, produced a nice artwork, a collage that we were going to put up onto the wall. But this was then blocked by the dean's office. One of the senior faculty managers, and put lots of bureaucratic stumbling blocks. The wall would be too rough for it, the sun would shine on it. We didn't follow the processes. This is not scientific enough, she also said. And so I spoke to my colleague at the visual arts department, and we were quite angry and said, what do they want us to put a microscope on this thing? But it highlighted certain things that became clear later on. So my colleague in the arts, the late Professor Elmi Costandius, who worked with me on that, and Professor Aslam Fatah, then did a book on visual redress at Stellenbosch. And they asked me to write something on this whole thing that happened. And I first refused. I said I couldn't write more than 100 words on art. I'm a physiologist. They persisted, and thankfully, and I had to do a lot of reflection on this. And this is from the book, an excerpt where I sort of, upon reflection, identified certain things. One is the power plays of institutional bureaucrats, the corporate university, neoliberalist university. And I wrote there, I propose a pushback against this so that we have academic freedom. And we see this is an issue now in the US, for example, and institutional autonomy not further eroded. And then I sort of stumbled on this thing of scientific elitism, that this was not scientific enough. It's a bit of arrogance. And I read more deeply around it and thought about it. And then I thought we should tackle this idea in terms of the scientists and our students to be better trained and look at wider context in terms of their training. So this scientific medical elitism, science is above it all. It's neutral and devoid of all context. There's a strong emphasis, at least in my field, on the biological and the physiological versus humane aspects. There's some alienation from other disciplines. And there's a bit of, at times, an inflated belief in this domain versus other disciplines. And so I did a lot of reflection on this. How am I going to do this module? And that we need to look at some of the surrounding issues we're facing. Some I've mentioned already: scientific elitism, neoliberalism, the fourth industrial revolution, AI, the post-truth world. We saw with COVID where sort of emotions and feelings is trumping, sorry for the pun, the truth and facts. And we're in the facts business, so to speak. Politically neutral institutions, and the decolonization as well, because a few years we had this eruption. And I've thought a lot about that. How do we do this in science is harder, and in medicine and biomedical sciences. In any case, this formed a sort of nice background for me and framework to develop this module and to focus on things such as philosophy, worldviews. I tried to art-science intersections, and I called it the features of science. I also brought into this a bit of humanity. Martha Nussbaum, the philosopher's ideas. She didn't write in the STEM field, but I sort of co-opted these ideas. That we should encourage critical thinking then in the training. We should promote opportunities for self-reflection, promote the idea of empathetic capacity, holistic views regarding the world's problems. And how do we solve this? Needs holistic approaches. And she stresses that we need to cultivate a sense of humanity also. So to look at oneself, critically reflect and examine life, number one. To see yourself as a group, you're bound to others, not the individual. And empathy, number three. And so this was the rollout of the course, several sessions with the students. And you can see that they find it daunting when I share this with them, the course guideline, because it's totally out of their comfort zone. Post-truth world, conspiracies, decolonization, all of those things. And so we have I've brought together 3 different departments, also a sort of new concept, because we all have silos, even within the medical faculty. So interdisciplinarity, and then I broke them up into groups. So you'll have anatomists speaking to biologists, to geneticists, all in one group. And it was basically all discussive, Socratic type of discussions in class, with additional lectures I co-opted to help lead the group discussions. And so then we have, after a quick blurb, they had to do pre-reading I do a little blurb in class, 10 minutes, summarizing some of the points, and then we're left with these open-ended questions, and they need to go and discuss that in their groups with a lecturer, myself included, and then they feedback after an hour or 45 minutes each group, and then we share our ideas from there as a discussion. And so we go through the entire scientific process in depth, from deductive reasoning, induction, hypotheses, Karl Popper, Thomas Kuhn, to the research proposals, ethics, but critically, peer-reviewed publications, predatory journals, preprints, the integrity of the science process, replication issues, all of the issues, And so we, for example, do a case studies. One is the study, the so-called colored women, if you've heard of it, who suffered from lesser cognitive function. There was a huge uproar a few years ago. So that was published. That was ethically approved and received funding. And we discussed this as part of this process. Their assessments are also quite unique. So they've got to do a reflective journal, and that's a lot of consternation at the start because they've never done this. And so, but they eventually enjoy it. A short essay, open-ended topic, what's their viewpoint on it, and a group video, also open-ended topics that they need to work together, produce a little video as part of the assessments that we can share, I think, for the broader public, science communication. These are some of the topics that they could investigate for example, the group video and also for the essays. So, and you can see it's quite high stuff. New liberalism in the scientific process in higher education, open-ended, friend or foe, our role in the post-truth world. Number 2, with pseudo-experts on social media, AI harms and benefits in medicine and science. Our current curriculum, number 4, to train students, is that good, yes or no? Myths and conspiracies, can we deal with this? Race-based science and medicine, links between colonialism and modern Western science. There's different steps of the scientific process, I showed you that. And what would the future science look like? So time is of the essence, but this is a video they produced, one of the students' groups. I just want to see if I can play it, and the chair can let me know if it's not, if you can't hear it or if it's a problem. So let's see if
It's just loading at the moment.
Play.
It's good.
I see it's hanging a bit.
Just
Okay, let's see. Maybe because I'm at home. Okay, let's see.
We haven't got any sound for this bit. Not sure if we're supposed to have.
Sorry? Is it not
No
working?
sound for this bit.
Oh,
I'm
I
not
see.
sure if we're supposed to have, but there was
I'll
sound
go on.
before.
Yeah. Okay, so the sounds disappeared. Anyway, that's what they produce. And so I also did a lot of focus on decolonization because I'm interested in that. No, sorry. And how to do it because it's difficult in medicine and I'm sure in other STEM, and I need a lot of thought. And what is it we're trying to do? So there's a couple, it's very difficult to define this thing as well. But these are a couple of definitions. It requires an understanding of the history of medical knowledge, focusing on medicine, and necessitates recognition of the professions and individuals' implicit biases. And so we need to embrace inclusive attitudes and practices, equitable provision of health care. Other one, to reconstruct global health engagement, to include things such as human rights, ethics, equity, and so on. And then to look at local and indigenous wisdom as well in this. Okay, so I brought this into the course, and we focus on this kind of framework. So how science and medicine led to the development of the idea of race and racism and the applications and impact in the clinic ultimately. So we look and explore. I ask the questions, how many races do we have in class? Students have never thought about that. And then I ask, what's your reasoning for that from a physiological basis? And they obviously struggle. And then we go back and discuss, that Carl Linnaeus brought up the 4 subspecies with people like Johann Blumenbach, who looked at a skull in Georgia and came up with the idea of Caucasoids, the 5 different races in inverted commas. Kant describing the human ideal in Europe, and then degeneration from that would be the other so-called races. And so the hierarchy of different races as well coming to the fore, that's discussed. The role then of journals in this as well. This is the Boston Medical Journal, and it's now the New England Journal of Medicine, very prestigious. And the type of work that followed from that's discussed. The emphasis to look at cranial characteristics, sizes of different so-called races, that spawned all of this type of research. And this was a paper by Dr. Robert Knox, for example, that he promotes the inequality of races, and that the notion of equality is utopian. It doesn't exist, in fact. And this is in the medical journal. And there's lots of examples we go through. I can't discuss them all. But then we look a little bit about Darwin. Not a lot of big focus, more on social Darwinism, but even Darwin comments civilized races, savage races. Eugenics, we go into Galton's ideas that if it's physiological traits, phenotypic traits, but also behavioral traits, and that those undesirable, inverted commas, traits should be outbred, so to speak, and that's eugenics. And then to tell the students, obviously, this was far more prevalent. Hitler didn't happen in a vacuum. People like John Harvey Kellogg, for example, 1911, started the Betterment Foundation, which was eugenics in nature, to basically, along the same lines, work towards this idea of superiority. And then 4 sterilizations in the United States we discuss, and all of that, and then we get to Nazi Germany. And then we end off, I'm not going to go through all of it, but this is an example practically in the clinic, the outcome of this type of thing. So medically, let's look so-called race, African American, black, non-black. Then we can do a measurement in their blood, serum creatinine. See if I can put on my pointer. There. Both levels the same in these individuals, 1.2, 1.2. But then to work out the function of the kidney, so to speak, there's an algorithm. And in that algorithm, there is a race multiplier, you see. And so after that, this individual's 93, higher value being better, and the other person, so-called white, 77. So you classed as normal chronic, CKD is chronic kidney disease. Normal or stage 1, the other person stage 2, although you've got the same circulating levels. And so this badly affected people's health at the end of the day. Because if you took out that, it would allow for earlier diagnosis of chronic kidney disease, better treatment options. And so a study was done to look at, if you remove this adjustment factor from that equation, it would have resulted in 3.3 million Black Americans receiving stage 3 chronic kidney disease diagnosis. 3 million people, 300,000 more qualifying for a nephrologist referral, and 31,000 for transplants on a waiting list. So these are just examples I share with the students when we discuss the idea that so-called black skin is thicker than white. PNAS 2016, they just looked at the beliefs, because this is now coming along for many, many years. Medical students and residents, half of them still had these beliefs, so which is crazy, in 2016. And that will influence medical judgments at the end of the day, because if one group has got a thicker skin, that's less pain, and you don't prescribe pain medication. And of course, we discussed the Human Genome Project that's basically shown clearly that there's no, this is Francis Collins' statement, we can't do racial boundaries. physiologically, genetically. It's all a socio-political construct. And all the evidence we go through. And the classification, even that's problematic. How do you classify people? So, any case, and then we look at the idea of race-based science and medicine. Now, as examples I've shown you, and how that must be taken out. That doesn't exist, and we look at race-conscious medicine. So race is defined as a social and power construct. What are the effects of structural racism? We need to teach these things as we do, and then how do we overcome these barriers in terms of inequities? So that's the decolonizing part. And then the last part now is to transdisciplinarity. So I went to the arts department and I set up a program and I gave a lecture on the heart because it's my specialist field, heart diseases, physiology, and the art students second years captured this in artworks. A few months later, we had an exhibit. And then I brought the biomedical students across to this exhibit and I said, guys, now you talk and discuss transdisciplinarity. In fact, I've built onto this program, but you can ask me in the question times what we did. So these are some of the artworks. Look at that. It's amazing. And then I've captured some of the thoughts of the biomedical students. And these are some of the comments. Although science often focuses on the detail, this experience taught students to consider the whole and bigger context and to include humane aspects. More artwork. Expand such viewpoints when focusing on the design of novel diagnostic and or therapeutic strategies to improve human health and well-being is another one. Although science objective and the art subjective focus on different aspects, there are overlap and interconnectivity between the two disciplines. And the last one for your sake here, scientists should sometimes take a step back from the detail to allow for more creative thinking that can lead to innovation and unique discovery. So fascinating. And we're continuing with this collaboration. Some of the comments from the students when we looked at feedback. On the race issue, that was a bit awkward at times. 67% of the class felt little to no discomfort. 17% experienced discomfort. But you can see it was a safe space. I could openly discuss and communicate to the class about these topics. I learned a lot and I realized that sometimes being put in uncomfortable conversations and settings is where growth happens. Generally, for the module, the class loved it. 88% thought it enhanced their critical thinking. Module really helped open my eyes a bit more in this science context. Find myself questioning things a lot more. I'm thinking about different perspectives, us as scientists, the community, target groups, governments, the markets. I'm also thinking about so many different questions that could be raised and possible answers. Nice one, my mind is buzzing. They felt more rounded as biomedical scientists, most of the class. My way of thinking has been challenged, but only for the better. I think it's the first time we've been confronted with these topics in an academic situation. We think of science as a separate entity from the rest of society, but it's such a huge part of it, and every other sector affects it and the way it works. Science is not isolated, and we should not treat it as such. Acknowledging how everything else affects how science is applied will help us to improve and even change some of the processes. I'm almost done. So just sort of thinking forward, how do we take this forward? I've spoken about the medical school, I've spoken about biomedical sciences, but how can we make this broader? So I think one step is to share this idea and the ideas as I've done tonight with you as widely as possible so that hopefully more can become change agents and we can collaborate on this. Then we need to collaborate to establish niche specific programs for various STEM environments. So within and beyond the university, beyond. So I spoke earlier about this a few weeks ago, and the physicists asked me, for example, how do we think of ideas in our environment? So you see that kind of thing. And then we've got to think how we bring these ideas into the undergraduate curriculum, which is something I'm actually just proposing now. I'm just waiting for feedback into the medical students' curriculum. I just want to punt a book I've published earlier this year that deals with these issues. It's almost the curriculum that I've taught for the Teachers of Science module, so that we can share these ideas more broadly, and that others can use it also as a resource if they want to teach something like that. I'm currently in the process working on a book volume to decolonizing medical research, teaching, and practice that hopefully should be published by year end if it goes well. And then I think just some teasers at the end, issues of concern. We see academic freedom in higher education now in the US under assault. That can happen anywhere. Tomorrow it could be us. And then can a university be politically neutral in this context? Because we're often in the ivory tower in the STEM disciplines. We should look at the traditional master's and PhD degrees, as I mentioned. It's quite technological, it's quite technical. And the PhD, for example, is a doctorate in philosophy. So how do we look at that more critically to get more rounded graduates that become change agents and that can deal with a complex world? And then trans and interdisciplinary approaches. How do we bring that into our research studies and into higher education? I've given you some examples there. Thank you very much for your time.
Thank you very much. That was really interesting. Are there any comments or questions?
I've put everybody to sleep, or they stunned?
Not at all. I just wanted to give everyone else a chance. Maybe if you mute yourself, I think there's a background. Okay, so my question is, I think this is really lovely, and I'm going to say, unfortunately, in my academic career, the sort of being exposed to this came quite late. In the early part of my academic career, it was as if I was very much a specialist coping with that. So, and just coping in the specialist side. Now, there's a reason for that. But my question is, yes, I get it that we should be more broad, and especially with our postgrads, we should try and include some aspects of that. But how do you do that without sort of losing the focus and the specialization? Because it must be a balancing act. Thanks.
Yeah, that's a very important question. Thanks for that. Yeah. So we've got the choice: either we stay as we are and we have our specialist approach, the reductionist approach. And I was wondering if any of our graduates with a master's or PhD, it was the COVID times, would meet somebody who's well read in the public domain, who read research papers and who's a conspiracy theorist. Let's make the example medical. And some of my students with a PhD even would have to be, let's say there's a braai in such a conversation. Our students would lose that debate. So it would become embarrassing almost, because we train one-trick ponies almost in that sense, that we focus on one molecule. I can speak for physiology. I mentioned integration, but it's strongly reductionist, the research we do. So you can become an expert in one molecule, which is great. I see my bandwidth. Maybe I should put off the camera, which is great. But do we then actually create thinkers? Do we create people who can think of what we're doing? How does it affect society? As we see now in the US, the scientists have been forced a bit out of that laboratory because of that kind of elitism, and to take to the streets. So I think in terms of the question, I think like at an honors level or master's PhD, there is time. So this module would take maybe 16 hours of your time out of a year. So I think if there's a will, there would be a way. And I think I would argue strongly that I think it's essential we make that time if we want to create individuals that are more, you know. So that study, I don't know if you guys are aware of that, of the colored women. How did we get to that point? Exactly because of this kind of naivety almost in the STEM, that I can't be bothered with context. Leave me alone with my molecule. So that would be my response. Yeah.
Yes, thanks for that. If nobody else has got any comments, I'll happily take that a little bit further. So nobody's come in with a comment. I think perhaps postgrad, I know you've spoken about getting it into undergrad, but definitely postgrad is the right level to do that, where the people have got some sort of foundation to build on and to feel confident with. Because one of my concerns, if you throw everything too wide, um, you can get people to totally lose their confidence in what they're doing. But if you give them time to get some knowledge, some experience, some expertise under their belt, then they're a little bit more confident to come out of their comfort zones and look at other things. So I think you agree with that.
I'll quickly add to that. Yes. So I think like an honors level is perfect because they've got coursework. You can even bring it into the masters if you have a bit of coursework throughout a year, or PhD level. Perfect. And they've got a foundation. For the undergraduate, I'm specifically targeting the medics and not this big thing. No, it would just be specifically on medical, this legacy to decolonization. A couple of sessions with them to expose them to the history, and then so that they're aware of the structural and the institutional legacies when they practice. So it will be quite focused. It will have none of the other things such as Karl Popper or Thomas Kuhn. So it will be a much more trimmed down version. But you're right. So what the in-depth module, definitely postgraduate. And one can slip it in, ideally in an honors, but there's also scope, I think, beyond that. Yeah.
Thanks. And while nobody else has got a hand up, always butting in, going back to one of your early slides, again, it's a comment. I love the thing about what a university does. It builds sort of people who are citizens, who are more rounded. I think that is really great. And I think that's something that the universities need to take forward. We were looking at it at WITS at one stage, and then I dropped off of that committee. But I thought that was very valuable because we weren't just building scientists and people with their different expertises. We were trying to build citizens as well, and we had this idea: what would a graduate attributes, it was called. So what would you want in a graduate? And I think that's very nice. And I think that is something that universities can offer beyond if you like, the tick box of people have done lectures in this. And I love the interaction that your course gives. One of the things that was really eye-opening, and I did it far too late in my academic career, really. I mean, it wasn't too late totally, but I wished I could have had it earlier, was to do a postgraduate diploma in education. And that was just, it was so difficult because it threw us all out of our comfort zones. And we ended up reading papers, and the papers were totally different from the papers that we were used to. And I can remember really battling to get through these papers because they were just so different. They were just written in such a different way. I like the bare bones and give me a table of the results and then start discussing them. But it was really good, and it really got us thinking about that sort of thing. And also the active learning, that you mustn't be passive, you've got to do things, Bloom's taxonomy and all that. And I think this is really great. And I think it's super that this does build on, it broadens things, but it gets the students to do things while they're doing that. So they're developing emotionally with experience and also with what their skill set and looking at things. And I think that's so great, because when I was an undergraduate, although we did have, I forget what they called it was something extension studies. So you weren't allowed to do anything scientific if you were enrolled in a science course. You had to do something with humanities and arts, but you could get round that. So I think that's just really good. Thanks.
Thanks for that. You're right. I also, on my journey, had to go through that exact same thing. The language, the lenses, and we train totally differently. It was a bit of a lot of discomfort, but it was good, like you mentioned, for me as well. I think we need to look at the role also of education, and you'll appreciate it, as an academic, because the emphasis is all on the other part, so to speak, your specialist research work. And then it's an afterthought, the teaching and learning. And so in terms of promotions, in terms of ratings, in terms of all kinds of things, so you de-incentivize that almost, although some universities are promoting this now. So that's also part of the issue, that it's almost an afterthought thing, and that people would just revert to the easiest way, and that's the passive lecture. Just get my lectures done, or these days put up a podcast and I can go back to the laboratory. Because what we're doing is now extra, needs additional time and effort and so on.
Yes, I can remember one of my colleagues and friends did the PG dip a year after me. And when he was trying the flipped classroom on the undergrads, it was really, he was quite shocked, because he was told, no, this is your job to get up there and teach. It's our job to listen. He was a bit taken aback by that. But yeah, it's got to be, it's something you've really got to try to, not just us to get us out of our comfort zones, but also what the students expect. I remember somebody calling students pots. They come in, you take the lid off, you put something inside in your lectures, you put the lid back on again, and then they go away again. And we want them to be something more than that.
Some people are leaving already, so if it's almost 6 o'clock.
Yeah, thanks for that. I don't, if there are comments from other people.
I see they've posted a few comments there, but not a question.
Yeah. Hey. Well, I don't want to hog all the comments. If there's nobody else who wants to say anything, I think I'll thank the speaker again and close the talk.
Thanks so much. Been a pleasure.
Yeah, thank you. It was it was mind-blowing in a way, because it showed some of the journeys that I tried to do, I think a bit unsuccessfully. Maybe if I'd been younger. But certainly these things need to happen, and we need to bring people more together in different ways. And I was so sad that your wall didn't come off, your unblank wall as it was going to be, and that just sounds so sad. But anyway, thank you very, very much for the presentation. It was really interesting, scary in some parts, but yes, it is something that we all need to do. Thank you very
so
much.
much.
Thanks a
Thank
lot.
you.
Keep well, guys. Bye.
Bye.